fitting nicely, I want to talk, and I think the cycling will really click, like it'll send a lot of light bulbs on for the listeners here who know you but may not know your story. So the first overall topic I want to talk about is your outlook on sport, because it is very stats focused, which is very cycling eccentric. But are you a fan of American sport? I'm not just talking MLR, but your baseball's American, because your outlook on sport is very American in
Yeah,
terms of stats focused.
absolutely. I am. Yeah. So I'd say I'm a very big fan of the NFL. In that I kind of probably watch in the season maybe 2 or 3 games a week.
Mm-hmm.
Baseball, I'm a fan of. I find it very difficult to follow in the UK, just because there's
Well, it's
162
impossible.
games
Yeah.
in a season, and there are ways of watching it. It's quite easy to watch, but just actually trying to keep up with the storylines is really difficult. When I was over in the US recently, though, I probably went to maybe 5 games in 2 weeks. So
Wow.
I'm a big fan. If I lived in the US, I would be, I'd be there a lot. Um, Basketball, I've never got into. I like the idea of it, and I've tried at various points. My old boss used to be was a very good basketball player, and I asked her to explain, why I should get into it, and she was very
Mm-hmm.
passionate about it. She made a good explanation. I thought, okay, I'm gonna give it a go, but I just couldn't really get there. And ice hockey, I like, but just to the point of I play some video games and I'll watch it if it's on. But again, there's not a huge amount of it to watch over here. But yeah, I do. I think I got into those sports. Well, I guess I, I've got into pretty much at various points over the years. I've got into pretty much every single sport,
Mm-hmm.
and those ones definitely chimed because of the stats element. Although I must admit, I was never any good at maths or anything like that. It was only when I read Moneyball, which I think is like incredibly cliche as an answer, but that was kind of what started me off on this.
Mm-hmm.
But I read that and I was like, okay, this is fascinating, and this could be going in rugby. And obviously, people had come to that conclusion before, but that was what kicked it off. And so once I read that, then I started getting into like sabermetrics and the baseball stats. And then I had an interest in American football since I was really young. So I remember reading a book in the school library when I was probably 9, about American football, and just reading that back to back multiple times. Um, I'd love to find that book again. I've got no recollection of who was the publisher or anything, but it was like a little tiny hardback American football book. But so that's where I
In,
started
in
with
in
that.
in the comments,
I
any
hope,
small American
yeah,
football, but people write it down, and we'll see if we can find it.
yeah, it was probably something like Dorling Kingsley one, but this would be 99 maybe, was it?
Right.
Maybe a bit later, but yeah, it was back then, and I just got obsessed with it over that book, and then yeah, stuff like cricket as well, which I'm big into. I like the stats around that. There's a fascinating book I was reading by Neil Lehman, I think it is. I think it's Neil. I think it's Lehman,
Right.
but which is about stats in cricket, which is kind of along the lines of Moneyball, I guess, but a bit more wide. Um, so yeah, lesser story. Nathan Lehman is a guy who wrote
Right.
it. Um, but yeah, so I think I've always had that take on it. I've always had that stats first approach to it.
Okay. It's so fascinating to me because as I was telling you before I came on air, I'm motorsport for rugby's the one I'm known for, but it's like the forbidden love is motorsport. Like I'll always have that on in the corner, out the corner of my eye.
Yeah.
I'm fresh off Le Mans weekend, so I'm
Oh,
absolutely
nice.
knackered. But
Yeah.
yeah, so I've done a 24-hour stint. Or I think I technically had a 3-hour involuntary nap when I couldn't keep my eyes open, but we got to there. So I'm very much a stat focused as well. Like I was telling you before you come out, you can watch a motor race via a timing screen and know what's happening without actually having to see the cars. So when I hear these stats and things, like you say, in your approach to sport and how the stats affect not only your perception of the sport, but how you choose to monitor the sport and on a macro level almost, because it fluctuates so much if you can go into such precise detail, but you can also almost determine a league purely on stats, which I find so interesting. And as we spoke, you use rugby, so I want to tell people a bit more about your job before we then take the next step. So you're currently an author for Rugby World Mag, but you're also the co-host of the Performance Analysis podcast.
Yeah.
So for my listeners that maybe haven't had the chance to listen to your podcast or seen the work you do, because would you technically say your job title is performance analyst or statistical analysis?
Yeah, I guess it varies a bit. So I guess I do freelance stuff for that would be, I guess, would classify me as a performance analyst. There's also like the recruitment analysis stuff, which is pretty much the same as performance analysis, but you're obviously looking for specific players for teams to sign. And then the journalism really was the best way of promoting that kind of stuff. Like I really like journalism. I think it's fantastic. I enjoy the stuff I do. But it was always I felt people should know more about this kind of stuff, and it felt like that was the best way of doing it rather than becoming a performance analyst full time.
Well, so I'm going to completely interject. The usual podcast situations happened of here's the order of you want your podcast to go, and within 3 questions, I'm flipping that over and ignoring it. So, in terms of when you said you do freelance recruitment analysis work, because I find this so fascinating, because this was what I would consider a dream job if I had the skill to do it, which is a club comes to you and goes, we want a winger that does this, this, and this. We need them to have this much skill. Go and find us the player, and then you have to go, here's the proof that this player does what he does. That sounds like an incredible job to have. How does that process work? So from you getting the first contact to the whole situation.
Yeah, so it's funny because rugby is much less I guess sophisticated than it might appear. So having talked to players and seeing it from the inside, you kind of think it's not that different to a decent Saturday kind of not professional, not even semi-professional, but a good club size on a Saturday who might get 200 fans out. It's not vastly different to that. And so typically what tends to happen is clubs will have performance analysts, and there will never be enough of them, and they'll always be asked to do too much. So what their jobs tend to be is very specific and not often changing that much, which tends to be why a lot of them kind of burn out and give it up after 5 to 10 years. And so what they tend to do is they will be focused on one very specific thing. And so they'll be looking at opposition defenses, opposition attack, and then looking at their own play, and then looking at training sessions and breaking them down, all this kind of stuff. But they won't often have much time to go ahead and look at recruitment analysis and look at players that they might want to bring in for the next year. So what tends to happen is that you'll get agents who will go to clubs that they think their players will be well suited for and say, we've got player X, player Y, player Z, here's what they're worth. Do you fancy them? And maybe include something about what they can offer, some stats around them, that kind of thing. But often not. Like very often that won't be in there.
Right.
And so what teams are increasingly doing is that they're asking, or they're getting people from externally to do this, or they're hiring the additional analyst and promoting the senior analyst to be the recruitment analyst or someone who they feel will be best suited for the job. So that's a long-winded little bit, but basically from the start, so you'll get a club will say, we're looking for this was a recent one I had. We're looking for the big lock who's not going to cost much money. And so then you think, okay, let's eliminate obviously everyone who's not locks, and then let's eliminate everyone who's not a big lock. So basically, if you're less than 6'4", and less than maybe 17, 18 stone, whatever that is in kilograms, then you kind of just get wiped off, and you're left with those people. Then you can just miss anyone who you think is going to be expensive. So, for example, within that category of lock, you'll get some big names. For example, you get Ectobeth would fall into that grouping, and obviously he's not going to go. And he's not going to go for less money. So you take him out, and then you'd be left with everyone who would be a big lock. It costs about that amount of money. So then I think that's fairly lacking in skill, but then the actual skill part of it is looking at them and breaking down what they do and how good they are. And actually, this is one of the fascinating bits is that although I obviously focus a lot on data, I do think that data is crucial because if you don't have data, then you can't really tell anything. So we're so fallible and we're so unable to correct the biases. So if we see someone do something amazing early in the game, it's likely that we're going to spend the rest of the game picking out the amazing things that he's doing after that point.
Right.
Whereas if we see someone do something really bad at the start, it might be that we ignore the next few good things he does because we've gone, oh, he's a guy who misses tackles, or he's a guy who misplaces passes, or whatever it might be. And you can actually see that in the data. So I asked the question today on Twitter about whether you'd rather have a kind of a winger who's a constant 6 out of 10, who never gets too good, never gets too bad, just steady, or someone who's sometimes a 4 out of 10 and someone who's sometimes a 10 out of 10, like a boom and bust type player.
Yeah.
And it was interesting because some of the responses named players,
I just if you name players, I thought that was a bit harsh. I was like,
yeah, exactly. I
yeah.
mean, it's sadly one of those things where basically either one, it almost sounds like a negative. I don't think it is. I think I often I have a lot of time for nuance. I think that if you're the 6 out of 10 rugby player, you can that's a very good living.
I was going to say that's a professional player, isn't it? That's it. You're always going to have a job.
Yeah, exactly. No one's gonna look past you because you can just consistently deliver. And equally, if you're someone who puts out 10 out of 10 performances, that's unbelievable. Like, if you think what a 10 out of 10 performance is, a performance that could not be improved upon, how many of them do you see a season? It's very, very few.
I was going to say, if you could guarantee prime Jonah Lomu for 4 games a season, that's still 4 games a season you're probably going to win, isn't it? So
yeah, exactly. And if you think what 4 out of 10 is it's just a bit below average. It's a bit kind of gaff. Yeah. It's like a winger who didn't really do much, which that's not the end of the world. But you got people getting named who don't actually fit in those in those categories. If you look at the stats, which is interesting, but also completely fits with what's logical. Because if you said, you got this one player, he's played 22 games this season, you've now got in your head to go back through every single one of those 22, which you probably didn't watch, and remember when he had a good game, when he had a bad game, and if he was a kind of player who just had consistently fine games, he's probably not going to stick out in your mind. And if you just happen to watch the bad games of his, but not the good games, then you're going to think he's bad. If you just happen to watch the last game, which was where he was amazing, then you're going to think he's amazing. And so you need the data to kind of say, okay, well, you think that it's a little bit nuanced, just a little bit different, and here's what the data says. But on the flip side, you can't just rely on the data. For one guy recently, I was doing some analysis for a particular player, and one of my points to him was that if you look at your statistics, there's too many games where you don't do anything productive with the ball. You kind of go missing in some of these games. And so we looked at the video to break this down, and what we found was that although those games, he wasn't hugely productive with the ball, he didn't have any opportunities. And what he was actually doing was when he got the ball, he was turning it into a positive. So, he might have got the ball just off a terrible pass that made him stop in his tracks. And instead of going backwards, he stepped in, made a yard, and went down, which doesn't really appear in the stats, or if it does appear, it appears to be negative. But actually, that is a useful thing to have in that situation where you're not getting the opportunity. Doing something like that with the ball is a big positive. So you need the both. You need the two of them. You need the video and the data to actually combine. But then I know I've got wildly sidetracked here. But to go back to the what happens, so you'll get the players that you think deserve a shot. It might be just one, it might be a few, with a write up about why you think they're good and some stats supporting that. Maybe some video clips. I quite like to include a few video clips in there. And then essentially, in my case, often you hear kind of a month or two down the line that they're getting signed, or they've decided to go with someone else, or someone else came on the market who was a better fit, who wasn't available at the time, or they've decided to wait till next year. Or in the case of some Welsh clubs, the budgets haven't been
We've
announced.
gone bust.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the budgets have gone, and there's literally no money for even if there's great players that appear. So that's typically how it goes about.
Oh, that's so interesting. I also liked you a little bit as well. You said players almost come to you, so there's kind of like a reverse for it as well. It's a player going, "I need to prove my worth," instead of the club trying to prove a player's worth.
Yeah, so there's a lot.
So does that work through the company you work with as well, or is that people come to you on a purely freelance basis?
Yeah, so they come on a freelance basis. So basically, I have a day job which isn't any of this kind of stuff. It's in advertising, but then
Join the club.
yeah. So it's still fun, but it's not quite the same. So I do that, but then the freelance stuff is players or agents will come to me and say, we're looking for a new contract, or we're going to be moving next season. How do we, what's the best way that we can convince teams of our performances? Or sometimes it's just a player saying, how do I get better? And what does the data say about that? So that's the other side of things.
That sounds like what would be one of my favorite things that I would not class as work, but would be work. So if I could ever find a way to monetize that would be grand. Sounds really good fun.
It is. I do feel I feel very lucky that people, like I said before we came on, I feel it's bizarre that people come to me. It's you still get the massive imposter syndrome, but which hasn't really shown any signs of going away. But it's still it is fun.
I get the same thing when people listen to this. Even before you coming on, because we were a bit delayed, I was just checking the analytics, and it still baffles me that people listen to this podcast. So I know exactly how you feel.
Yeah.
Not saying that nobody's going to listen to your episode when this goes live, but
no.
It still baffles that people do.
I agree. I think I don't think that goes away though. When you speak to people who are incredibly famous, who you look up to, they still feel the same, which is depressing. I guess it's comforting and depressing in equal ways. But it is pretty depressing.
It's so baffling. I mean, I still get excited when I get like 20 likes on a personal Instagram post. Never mind anything for the podcast page.
Yeah.
Got 20 people from school still care what I'm doing in my life. That's good to know. So,
yeah, I know the feeling.
Yeah. We're all just kids in our room at the end of the day. That's all.
That's true. That is true.
God, that was a bit of a grounding sentence there. Bring back the positives.